In today's tutorial, what we're going to do is add the alien into our game, and we're also going to add in the firing of the button. So that's the two goals for today. Before we begin, the little sound when you hit the A button is this WAV file. So make sure that you download the file and place it in the root directory of your CircuitPython. The next thing that we're going to be talking about is our constants file. So one of the problems with the being able to press the A button to make the sound is, remember that our PyBadge is updating the game logic 60 times a second. So if you push down at the button and even release it really fast, it's going to be recognize that it's down several times in a row, because 60 times a second is really fast. So what we need is some way of keeping track of when the buttons were pressed last, because you'll notice when I did the demo, you have to press the button and then release it and then press it again to make the sound happen. And that sound is going to eventually trigger a missile to be fired from our spaceship. And we don't want 60 missiles a second to be firing out of our spaceship, because that would make the game too easy. So we need some way to keep track of, I've pressed the button, I'm still pressing, and I've released. So you'll notice this is the constants file, and I've added this section at the bottom, and it's called button state. So if you've never seen this before, it is a variable type, and this is called a dictionary. So it's a very special type, and what happens is that it's a key value pair. So it holds several pieces of information, 4 pieces of information for us, and the first element is the key and the second element is the value. I'm choosing for both of them to be strings for me. Dictionaries could be all kinds of different things, but this is what we're going to use it for. So we're going to have 4 distinct states. The button is currently up. The button was just pressed for the very first time. The button is continuing to be pressed. And finally, the button was released. So we need these states because what I want to happen is, this is the only state where I want the sound to happen that I've just pressed. So we need to keep track of all of these things, and if we can, then we can have an if statement checking if the button has just been pressed. So you're going to have to add this to your constant file so that we can access that. The next thing you'll notice is that I actually had my little alien space dude showing up at the top of the screen, so we need to add him in. So we've added in a spaceship before. You'll notice I have another variable called alien, and I followed the exact same process. We have stage, sprite, image bank sprites. Now I'm picking a different image, okay, because we want it to be a different image showing up. So number 9 is the alien. I then have my X value, so I'm placing it in the middle of the screen. And then I have my Y value, and it's just slightly down, so one whole image 16 pixels down. So this is my variable alien, and just like we did before when we had the ship and the background, I'm deciding to put it in the middle. We add the alien in. Once again, it's still in square brackets. We'll explain why later, because eventually we're going to have several aliens, and this is going to be a list. Okay, and then we should also add it into the very bottom. So you'll notice when we're rendering, we actually have the alien showing up too. So those sections of code will make the alien show up, and we've seen how to make sprites show up before. So hopefully there's no major problem with that. So the next thing we need to talk about is this game state for the buttons thing. So you will notice that I've added in 4 new variables. And the 4 new variables are for special buttons that I don't want repeating actions to happen. Now on our D-pad, I chose to actually just leave it the way it was previously, because I do want 60 actions per second to actually happen. So when I'm pressing left or right 60 times a second, I want my alien to move right or left by 1 pixel. But that's not what I want to happen to the other buttons. So remember, we had 4 other buttons: A, B, Start, and Select. So I create a variable for each of them, and I'm assigning them constants and then button state. Remember, that comes from our constants file, button state, and then I'm assigning it a current state. And at the very beginning of our program, the current state is button up. And all of them are like that. So when the game first starts, nobody's touching any of the buttons. So this variable here, A, has a value of button up. And they all equal that. So I'm defining those variables at the beginning, and then during our game loop, I'm going to change what's happening with those. The next variable we need to get set up and running is our sound file. So we've never had sound before yet. So I create a variable, and I'm just calling mine the Pew sound, because that's what it is, because it's opening a file on our PyBadge. Don't worry about this. If you want to talk to me, I can explain what that is. But it's opening up this file and assigning it to this variable. UGame, remember we imported UGame at the very beginning. So someone has created a nice audio library for us, and we're calling that variable sound. Now, just to make sure that everything is okay, remember this is at the very beginning of my program for the very first scene. I'm just going to stop all sound from happening, so that if for some reason someone left the PyBadge running in some weird state where there is sound coming out of it, I stop it right away. So we stop it, and I want to set mute to false. So you could actually have a button, maybe the B button we could set, press it later, and that will turn mute on and off. So you could do that. So at the moment, we just have the sound file ready, and we have the sound object for audio up and running. We've turned off all the sound, and we won't let anybody touch mute, so the sound will always be running. So the sound is ready, and once we understand what to do with our buttons, then we can activate this. So we're going to go down into our gaming loop. So here we are in our gaming loop, and remember, we get the information from what's happening on our buttons, and remember this is happening 60 times a second. And then we're going to talk about the A button. So the A button is going to be the firing, but for now I just wanted to figure out whether the sound should be playing or not. So here's the slightly confusing code to make the A button work. So we've had this before. It was an if statement, and if this is true, that means the A button has been pressed. Okay, it's being pressed, but is it the first time it's been pressed? Is it been pressed for 3 seconds so far, so we shouldn't let the sound happen? What's going on? So remember, the initial state of the button was button up. So if A button is equal to button up, that means the button was up, but now it's being pressed. So that means it's the very first time that this thing has ever been pressed. So change the state to just being pressed. If for some reason the button is being pressed, that's why we're inside here, and it's not in the state button up, then the only other state that it probably could be in is it has been just pressed. So if I press the button and just leave my finger on it, this is going to be true over and over and over again. And if it is true over and over and over again, then we'll just keep it on button pressed. Sorry, just pressed to still pressed. So we started with it wasn't pressed, but we know that we just pressed it, so we set it to this state. If I am in this state, okay, if I'm in the just press state, but I'm still holding down the button, then set it to the button is still pressed down. So this happens if the button was pressed. Either we were up and we're now just pressed, or we were just pressed and now we're still pressed. If you are still pressed There's no else if for that, because if you're still pressed, just stay at still pressed, doesn't matter. If the A button wasn't pressed, so we come down here, then we go into this state. Okay, there's a couple things that can happen. If I was still being pressed, so I've been pushed down and it stayed for a long time, but now I'm not being pressed, then the button should be in the I was just released state. Else, if I wasn't still being pressed, then that means I'm in the up state, so just make it up. So I know this is a slightly confusing nested if statement, but it does actually work. So A button, that variable, will now keep track of, am I in button is just up, the button was just pressed, it's still being pressed, or I'm back to being button up again. So that code makes that happen. So once we have that, we're good to go. So you'll notice B button, we're not doing anything with it. Start and select, it just prints to the screen at the moment. We'll eventually have to change that. The left and right, we're not changing anything on there. And the up and down, we're not changing anything on there. Okay, so now under game logic, now that I know what the state of the button is, if the button, A button, has just been pressed, then this makes the sound happen. So sound.play, and what sound file should I be playing? And this was my pew sound. So that will play the button. So this is needed here for the sound. If I didn't have that and I just said, if someone is hitting the A button, play the sound, remember 60 times a second, this would start up. 60 times a second, the sound would start from scratch every time, and it would sound horrible. You can give it a try, but it doesn't sound very good. So this solves our problem of keeping track of what the A and B button state currently is, and we're good to go, and now we can only press the button and make the sound come out. So once again, you will notice that as soon as I press the A button, the sound happens, but if I press and hold, nothing happens. Remember still, I can still move my character back and forth. And if I release it, then we're back into the button up state. And if you try to do it several times, as fast as you can press, that's what's going to make the sound happen. So that's all we have for today.